The Duval story has it all. Private jets, helicopter holidays, driveways stacked with luxury cars, a high-profile couple shining with diamonds, rubbing shoulders with Super Rugby players, sponsoring the Blues in a winning season, a swanky lifestyle documented on Instagram and set to swamp our big screens too in a reality television series.
I'm a very difficult human being to be around.
That was going to be the opening line of episode 1, but the drama of reality TV has nothing on what came next for Duval founders Kenyon and Charlotte Clarke. A raid by armed police, assets frozen, guns and jewellery seized, and the couple stripped of control of their company, the government stepping in. So how did this all unfold, and what's happened to almost $240 million? That's how much the people who are now in charge say needs to be paid back. This is the Duval story. Let's take you back to the boom years, when this apartment complex was a promising investment, soaring above the Manukau skyline with no hint of the troubles to come. Right back to the months just before the pandemic.
We're New Zealand's second most active apartment developer.
I'm the guy who built a $750 million property empire.
We're going to be based offshore, so we're opening offices in Singapore, Hong Kong, mainland China and in London. And so I'm definitely going to be working on our international rollout.
We were looking at the social media. This guy was saying things like, hate is the thing that sharpens my blade kind of thing, and posting pictures of himself next to his Rolls Royce with Duval 1 number plate on it.
BusinessDesk property editor Maria Slade has been following Duval closely since her first article in 2021 raised concerns.
This is not normal behaviour for a property developer who's just trying to get on with the business of building houses,
It sort of seemed to come from nowhere.
Litigation specialist Jackie Lethbridge was also watching Duval's rapid rise.
It proliferated very quickly, from being a property development group to then also being an investment group, in my view, really focused on selling to the public via things like social media.
As we knew, the regulators were watching them as well. I think it was 2021 they gave them the first warning about the way they were advertising these products, that it just really wasn't appropriate to be going out on Facebook and advertising returns, because then you're capturing a whole group of people who really shouldn't be captured by these types of investments.
Here is where we meet Anita. That's not her real name. She doesn't want to be identified, but still wants to share her story as a Duval mortgage fund investor.
150,000. Yeah, I could do with that right now. So that's just gone.
This memento, a Duval scented candle stamped with an inspirational quote, is all she has to show for that 150k. Anita says she briefly met founder KenyonClarke on her first visit as a potential investor, and Duval staff sung his praises.
He's come out of a bankruptcy already once, and he's learned from that lesson, and he is wanting to solve the housing issue with New Zealand, and he has really smart ideas about how he can source that funding, and it's not going to be nationally, it's going to be internationally, because he's got access to overseas investors, and he doesn't need to rely on the banks, and he's got his own way of doing it.
Yet Duval was also offering 10% returns paid out quarterly to local investors.
You've got to look at the environment at the time. The interest rates were incredibly low. It was at that period where we went right down as low as they'd ever been. And so you were getting nothing for your term deposits in the bank. A lot of people were looking at that going, well, hey, I can get a much better return for my money, why not? But the trouble is, with a high interest rate like that, with a high return, comes very high risk. And this is something that wasn't really widely understood, I think, by a lot of the people who put money into these property investments.
Anita was deemed eligible, but now thinks she shouldn't have been.
So they want sophisticated investors who know what sort of risk you're getting into, and I was neither. I said to them that I've played around with sharesies, and my ex-husband was in business, and I know a little bit about investing, and they took me on.
they made use of the wholesale investor regime. A wholesale investor, there's two ways you can be one. One is you can basically be wealthy, and in which case you have to have at least 5 million of wealth or put a minimum of 750,000 into one investment. But there is a bit of an exclusion in the law in which you can be a so-called eligible investor, in which you get someone like your financial advisor to certify that you know what you're doing. And so a whole lot of people, retired teachers, farmers who'd sold a bit of land, that kind of thing, got caught putting their money into this investment which really wasn't appropriate for them just because of the high risk involved.
Anita had told a relative, an accountant overseas, to sign her off as an eligible investor with the paperwork a Duval rep gave her. KenyonClarke told me he's not aware of her case, but says investors need to read documentation properly and seek professional advice. And if they follow that advice, investing is their choice. Put simply, he says, people should be grown-ups. Why would you need to go to local investors? Why not just go to a bank or some big offshore fund or something like that if you're dealing in multi-million-dollar property developments?
Because they needed the money. A lot of their lenders were not what you might call mainstream lenders. People like the US 1543 capital investor, more of people who would charge quite a lot for the money they were lending Duval. And so they really needed the funds to feed the pipeline of the developments they were doing.
KenyonClarke was bankrupted after the global financial crisis in 2008. He's told me the lesson he took from that was to spread any funding risk rather than being on the hook to just one bank. It's a lesson he's shared before.
I would suggest for anyone who was concerned about or who wanted to build some real financial resilience into their portfolio or into their business, diversify your banking risk.
So we have a property company building multi-million-dollar developments, leveraging the funds of average Kiwis with limited capital who are classed as eligible investors and promised a 10% return. It all seemed to be working for a couple of years, but in late 2022, payments stopped and communication dried up too.
I didn't even know whether they were compounding the interest or anything.
And so a new scheme was born. Duval asked investors like Anita to swap what it owed them for shares in the company and then take it public.
I just started getting a bit worried about things. You know how you get a gut feel that something is not right? And they just weren't getting their paperwork ready to get onto the New Zealand Stock Exchange.
Anita didn't take the deal, but why didn't she speak up sooner if she had doubts about the empire KenyonClarke had built?
Well, if FMA takes over and does anything, it just may mean that he may fail, which means that only the investors will suffer. So I was just hoping that he will just stop wasting money, going on his big overseas trips, going in the helicopter and going shooting and start giving the investors the money that they deserve. Start being sensible and taking a little bit of ownership for what he's doing.
KenyonClarke told me that in his view at the time, Duval directors had made a very sound decision to ensure cash was preserved so that the mortgage fund could continue lending to Duval property projects. He said distributions were only deferred, as directors were entitled to do, while the business coped with a 40% increase in construction cost prices.
There was one big one that they were doing in Mount Wellington called the Verge Apartments, a twin tower thing. And progress on that seemed to be painfully slow. And there were just all sorts of stories coming out about subbies not getting paid and this sort of thing. And then there were weird things that were happening, like Duval actually kicked its own construction company off one of its sites, which was the big Mountain Vista Estate townhouse development in Mangere. And so we kind of thought things would just start gradually falling apart, that companies would fail. But then bang, 2nd of August 2024, the government brought out the big guns.
A dramatic raid on the home of Duval founders Kenyon and Charlotte Clarke and all their personal assets frozen.
They're called preservation orders, and I've done many cases under the High Court rules which are similar. And where you have individuals who are intimately associated with companies and other entities like trusts, and we need to freeze the assets, the High Court will routinely appoint what's called a receiver or custodian over their affairs and over their assets. And it's just to preserve the position, hold it in time so that investigation can be undertaken to understand what's truly happened.
Duval was seized too. Investors, subbies on sites, even employees left with IOUs. Regulators went to court to appoint a receiver. Now, a receiver is someone who takes charge of a company when it's in trouble. But they're usually appointed by someone that's owed money by that business, not by the authorities.
With companies who are offering financial services and who are regulated by the Financial Markets Authority, or the FMA, special powers are given to the FMA to apply to the High Court to get involved, to ensure that people are appointed if they are deeply concerned that there are irregularities that could affect investors.
The China Construction Bank had lent one Duval company $17 million. And as news of those raids broke, it swiftly appointed its own receivers to try to seize control of these properties and sell them off. What came next hadn't happened for 14 years.
Interim receivers were appointed first, and this, as we now understand, was really a stopgap measure to the full sort of shebang, if you like, of statutory management, which is a very rarely used tool. They did their initial report, that got put to the government, and the government said, right, we're calling in the statutory managers. And that's a really big deal. They've actually got to go to the Governor-General and get that signed off. It's not something you do every day.
It was obviously quite an extreme move to jump in there and call time to it. Have we seen enough to sort of understand what might have prompted that?
Well, I haven't seen the order. That's still suppressed. But in order to exercise that power, the court's got to be really satisfied that a high bar is being crossed to show, usually dissipation. What that means is that assets are being taken out of the jurisdiction, taken out of the country, they're being moved out of the group of companies or away from the individuals, so that if people want to recover against those individuals, they can't then access those assets.
KenyonClarke is emphatic. He's told me, I'm unsure of what any concerns are about money being moved offshore, and let me be really clear with you, I categorically have not done that. He says Duval had leased, opened and then closed a Singapore office, but staff had been paid from New Zealand.
You appoint a statutory manager because it's a very complex situation, which was the case with South Canterbury Finance. There's lots of money involved, and also whether there's the potential that crimes have been committed.
The government put the receivers in charge as statutory managers, led by John Fisk of PwC, one of the big four global accounting firms.
Mr. John Fisk is in total control.
John is one of the most senior insolvency practitioners in New Zealand. He is extremely experienced in the collapse of finance companies. For example, he was the receiver of Lombard Finance. It's another big finance company collapse that was in the public. John is extremely experienced in dealing with those types of complex cases where there are a multitude of different creditors.
He's told us that it will sort of go in two parts. The first part is the trying to unwind everything phase, try and sell off the properties that are there, pay people as much as they can, see what money's left. And then the second part, although they sort of do cross over, is the investigation part, where they start trying to look at what happened, where did the money go, what went wrong, and should any charges be laid against anybody. But,
you know, a proper investigation must be undertaken to give those directors of the companies and the benefit of the doubt in that regard.
KenyonClarke's response, complexity is not a crime. Out on the building sites, here they're back on the tools. Some of these are pre-sold. People may want the homes they bought, and large overseas lenders want their millions back. Other sites are under repair. Still getting paid? Yes. I wouldn't be here otherwise. Some bare plots are on the market as is, looking for the next developer to take the risk. Some investors are worried this is starting to look like a Duval fire sale for the benefit of overseas lenders, and that fees owed to statutory managers will take whatever is left. But plenty just want whatever can be recovered, knowing that there's a long line of people in front of them who also have claims.
The way it goes is you've got your secured creditors like your mortgage holders, and then you've got your preferential creditors like the IRD, and the liquidators, I might add, they get their fees, or the receivers I should say.
Like an insolvency practitioner and those people advising them, they're like the surgeon in the operating theatre when you have been involved in a major car accident. And like those surgeons, It's complex work which requires extensive experience, and it comes at a cost. You're doing it urgently.
Then you've got your unsecured creditors, people like the tradies that are still owed money, and then the shareholders and the investors are kind of further down.
Because when you strip it all away, the Duval Property Group, it's a property development company, and that is inherently risky. And the lending arrangements that are normally in place mean there's very high penalty interest rates. All of these loans, a lot of them will be in default, and that extra interest being piled on to what those secured creditors can take out first, that is what's going to create a big hole for the unsecured creditors.
So at this stage, it's not looking incredibly likely that the investors will get anything back, or not get very much back anyway.
Do you think you'll get any of it back?
I'm not holding my breath.